Welcome to CE Online. We are so happy to see you today. I'm looking forward to today's impacting service. During the service, you may have some questions, comments, or prayer requests. Just go to churchexperience.tv/connect or pull out your camera app and scan the QR code to connect with us, or you could even hit that subscribe button if you always want to know what's going on here at CE. We're always glad to hear from you, get back to you, and be praying for you. Guess what time it is? Time to spend time worshiping God through the message. Let's jump in, participate, and let God speak to us during this time.
So one thing I think we all have in common is our love for a good story. Who's with me on that? We love a good story, whether it's a book. Some of you are readers, I know that. Whether it's a movie. We are in a movie theater, so we watch movies. We love a good movie. Fiction, nonfiction. My favorite movies are the ones that are based on a true story. Sometimes it's amazing to kind of say, wow, this is based on true stories. Some of this actually happened. I know Hollywood kind of takes its liberties sometimes, but some amazing true stories are out there. Maybe one of your favorite stories is something that happened to a friend, and whenever you guys get together, you share that story maybe from school days or something like that from back in the day. Maybe it's your most embarrassing moment. Maybe that's a story that's getting told a lot from other people about you. Your most embarrassing moment. Maybe it's some legendary story in your family, right? Stories that you enjoy hearing and telling whenever you're together with your family. They just love telling the family stories, some of the things in your family history. We all love to hear, and many of us like to tell stories. But here's the thing. While those events were happening in the moment, nobody in the moment was thinking in terms of story. It was just in the moment. It was just happening then and there. So it's not really apparent, but should be for each of us then, that the events of our life are actually creating the story of our life. It should be apparent because when someone asks you about your past, someone asks you where you're from, right? You dip into your story and you tell them where you're from and how you got to where you are today, or where you went to school. You dip back into your story and you tell them about when you went to school and where you went to school. Something actually happens to you. What do you do? It's all part of our story, the story of our life. And this kind of thinking, this concept kind of sets us up for what we're going to talk about today. Every significant or unusual current event in your life, every season of your life, once it's happened and it's behind you, becomes a story we tell, right? Or becomes a story we hope we never tell. Are you with me on that? A story maybe too embarrassing or too painful to tell. And often the determining factor as to whether or not we want to tell the story is the decisions that we made while we were living it. While the story was still unfolding. While the ending hadn't yet been determined. The decisions that we make during the moment determine whether or not it's going to be a story we want to tell or a story we never want to tell. So the truth is, and we touched on this last week, the truth is we write the story of our lives one decision at a time. And if we will think that way, our lives will end up with a lot better story. We write the story of our lives one decision at a time. We'll talk about more in just a minute. So we're in week 2 of this series, Yes and No, the power of making not just decisions, but the power of making God-pleasing decisions. And the big idea behind this series is simply this, that good questions are connected to good decisions. Good questions and good decisions go together. They're connected. And as we said last week, good questions set us up for making good decisions. We ask good questions before we have to make the decision, we'll likely make a better decision. In fact, in some way, our decisions are no better than the questions that we ask or the questions that we don't ask. And here's the promise of this entire series. If we will ask, and if we will answer honestly, and then act on those honest answers to the 5 questions we're talking about in this series, I promise you, you will make better, God-pleasing decisions, and consequently, your life will end up with fewer regrets. How many want to sign up for that? I want to sign up for fewer regrets, absolutely. And so there's the connection between good questions and good decisions, and if we ask those questions, answer them honestly, and act upon them, we're heading in the right direction. It'll give you a better life. And the people who look to you and depend on you, it will affect them in a better way. Their lives will be better too. Because we know, as we learned last week, we aren't the only ones affected by our decisions, and we aren't the only one affected by our regrets either, are we? Now, last week I challenged you to memorize a verse out of the wisdom book of Proverbs, and here it is, Proverbs 27:12. Hope maybe some of you have already memorized it, but let's say this together. All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Read it with me. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Say it again. The see and but the. All right, now close your eyes. The prudent danger and take, but. All right, we're getting there. We're getting there. I want you to memorize that verse. Have that verse in your memory. The prudent, they see danger and they do something about it. They respond appropriately. The prudent see danger and they take action. They take refuge. But the simple or the naive, well, they just keep on going and pay the penalty. Another translation says, and they suffer for it. And the reason I want you to commit this verse to memory is because as simple and straightforward as the 5 questions are, they will bring you into direct conflict with the sales associate that lives in your head. Because this little sales associate that lives in your head sounds a lot like your voice. Right? And they want you to act now. Hey, this deal expires in 5 minutes. You gotta make this decision now. They want you to decide fast. And they want you to focus on the immediate rather than the ultimate. So this verse is a wise reminder to look beyond the moment and pay attention to the potential dangers associated with one of the options that you catch yourself trying to sell yourself on. So these 5 questions will help you slow down, hit the pause button in order to create the perspective you need to actually see the danger coming. Wouldn't you like to see the danger coming before you actually get there? Wouldn't you like to see the danger coming before it swallows you up or takes you down? This is what we're talking about. Because we've all gone down that road of the simple, where we just keep right on going and we pay the penalty, right? So let's not do that anymore. Let's determine right here, right now, today, that we are going to be the prudent, to see the danger coming. And these questions will set us up to do that. This verse will give you the perspective you need to connect the dots between the options you're considering and the future you may prefer or the future you want to avoid. to see it. Now, last time we introduced the first of the 5 questions. The first question, again, has to do with this sales associate in our head. It's the integrity question. And the integrity question says, am I being honest with myself? Really? And we have to add the word really because we sell ourselves on a lot of junk, right? So I hope since last time we met that you've been honest with yourself, really honest with yourself. Am I being honest with myself about this decision, or am I trying to sell myself a regret? Being honest with yourself, even if it means making you feel a little bad about yourself, it's okay. Rather see it and avoid the danger than see the simple and just keep on going. Because as we said last time, acknowledging where we really are is the first step to getting where we ultimately want to be. And I know we ultimately want to get this right. I want you to get this right. And God wants you to get this right. So in making a decision of any magnitude, okay, the first question we're going to ask ourselves, am I being honest with myself? Really, that's the first of the 5 questions, okay? Today I want to give you 2 more questions for us to ask when making a decision. And the second question I want to give you is called the legacy question. And anytime you're making a decision of any magnitude or any consequence, I want you to pause and ask what's called the legacy question. And the legacy question is this. It's on the screen. What story do I want to tell? Again, we love stories. And so as far as the story of your life is concerned, let's think about the legacy question. What story do I really want to tell? Think about it this way. When this decision, or maybe this entire season of life that you're in, when this relationship, when this business transaction is reduced to simply a story that you tell someday, what story do you hope to tell? Do you want to be the hero, or do you want to be the villain? Do you want to be the wise or the stupid? Do you want to be a good example, or do you want to be the bad example? Which option will make this story worth remembering and worth telling, as opposed to a story you hope no one ever tells and no one ever finds out about? Do you see where we're going with this? What story do you want to tell? Which option would make this story something you'll be proud to tell your children someday, or even your grandchildren someday? Which option sets me up for a better story? And here's the good news. You get to decide. We get to decide, but again, you decide one decision at a time, because as far as it's up to you, you write the story of your life one decision at a time. And every decision you make becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. That's kind of a phrase we take back from school, right? This is going on your permanent record. I wonder where my permanent record is now. You know, I wonder that sometimes. A permanent record from school. Whatever happened to that permanent record? But as far as our life goes and making decisions, every decision you make will become a part of your story, your permanent story. Every decision you make has an outcome, has a consequence, has a result, whether it's good, bad, desirable, undesirable, expected, unexpected, whatever the case, that outcome from that decision becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. For example, let's say your boss comes along and he asks you to lie to a client. And you choose to lie to the client, and the client eventually finds out and calls you out on it, and the boss lays the blame all on you. And then you lose your job. So now part of your story is that you lied, and you lost your job because you lied. That's not a good story. What about this story? Your boss asks you to lie, and you choose not to lie. You still lose your job because you wouldn't do what your boss asked you to do, but isn't that a better story? Or how about this one? Your friends want you to go out, but you have an exam to study for. And you said no. Instead, you stayed in, you studied, and you aced the exam. That was a decision that you made. And you did it over and over, and now you have a degree to show for it. That's a good story. The point is, every decision and outcome of that decision becomes a part of your story, which means decision by decision, one decision after another, you are writing the story of your life. We don't tend to think this way, but it's true. Now, the challenge to this is that in the midst of our current events, in the midst of circumstances that we're living in, we don't think in terms of story, but we don't take it into account. Someday we're going to have to tell this story. For example, if you recently lost your job, and you're surviving during this season without a job, and one day this is going to just be a story that you tell. So what story do you want to tell? Well, yeah, 5 years ago, I lost my job. I was embarrassed. I started drinking too much. I racked up some unnecessary debt. I lost the respect of my friends and my kids. Again, that's not a great story. I mean, definitely going for a period of time without work can certainly be terrifying, but the decisions we make in those valleys eventually are just stories that we tell on the other side. Let's say maybe you're dating someone and things are going okay, but there's someone else in the picture. And she's married or he's married, but you find yourself gravitating in their direction and they seem to be gravitating in your direction. And you get the sense that if you're willing, they're willing. And in the moment, your decision will be a permanent part of your story, the permanent part of her story, the permanent part of his story. What story do you want to tell? I got involved with someone at work who was married. I ended up busting up their marriage. And now their kids flip back and forth between two homes on the weekends. Is that the story you want to tell? I don't think so. And here's another thing I think is true of all of us. We'd all like to be able to tell our entire story without skipping any parts. Or having to, lie about the details. I mean, someday you'd like to sit down with your kids and maybe even your grandkids, maybe someone you hope to spend the rest of your life with someday and tell your entire story. And isn't it true that we'd like to be the hero of our story, right? I think we all want that. I think going forward, you can have that story. From this point forward, you can do that. But it'll require you to stop, ask honest questions, answer them honestly, and act upon them. The legacy question. What story do you want to tell? Which of the available options do I want to be a permanent part of my story? Because the decisions you're wrestling with right now, even the small decisions you're wrestling with right now, are going to be nothing more than a story that you tell someday. Now, I think the Old Testament story of Joseph is kind of a great reminder of how powerful the legacy question really is. And many of you are already somewhat familiar with the story of Joseph. Joseph and his many coat of colors. We've heard that story before. So I'll just kind of give you a condensed version. But around 1800 BC, a 17-year-old named Joseph, the 11th of the 12 sons of Jacob, finds himself in a no-win situation that is not of his own making. Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons, which you can imagine caused some jealousy amongst the 10 oldest brothers. Okay, you can imagine that. And eventually their jealousy gets the best of them, and they decide to kill Joseph. But at the last minute, they lose their nerve and decide to sell him instead to slave traders. And then they're going to tell their dad, Jacob, that he was killed by a wild animal. They even wipe blood on that coat of many colors and say, Dad, he got killed by a wild animal. But in reality, they sold him into slavery. So Joseph ends up on the auction block in Egypt, where he's purchased by a military officer named Potiphar. Now Joseph has a decision to make. He's adding to the story of his life. He's been sold to this guy named Potiphar. So what does he do? Does he run? Do I be like most slaves and do as little as possible with a bad attitude? I don't want to be here kind of thing. Or do I make the decision to throw myself into this whole slave thing and give it everything I've got? And again, here's what makes the story relatable to many of us. None of this is his fault. He didn't do anything to deserve this. And many of us find ourselves in situations that other people have done to us by their decisions. Someone else hijacked Joseph's story, like some of you have. Your story's been hijacked by somebody else. It was hijacked by evil, hijacked by selfish people. And so we can get in that mindset, well, then why try? I don't deserve this anyway, so why do anything at all? That's kind of always a temptation when things happen to us that aren't our fault. But Joseph overcomes that temptation. He overcomes the temptation to give up. Instead, he decides to serve Potiphar's household as if it were his own house. He gives it everything he's got. And eventually Potiphar gives him more responsibility, and he ends up in charge of Potiphar's entire household. Okay? And think about it. This is a story worth telling. I was sold into slavery. I was kidnapped by my brothers, sold. I was a victim. But I decided not to live like a victim. That was the story Joseph decided to write. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to give it everything I've got. But then the music changed for Joseph. See, Joseph's story intersects with somebody else's story, Potiphar's wife. And he finds himself once again, by again, no fault of his own, in a no-win situation because Potiphar's wife insists that he become her lover. As the world turns, here we go, right? So Joseph has two options, and neither of which lead to really a good outcome for him. Because in this culture, this was a life and death issue, and probably more like death and death issue. Because either way he decides, he can lose his life. And just to point it out, he's only 19 and 20 years old. How smart were you at 19, 20? But once again, Joseph opts for a better story. So I want to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 39. So we find this story. Starting at verse 7, this is what it says. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Okay? And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. He wants to tell a better story than that. He says, "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care." Look at verse 9. "No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, Mrs. Potiphar, because you're his wife." So again, instead of thinking of the immediate, Joseph is thinking of the ultimate. He's thinking of the better story. He's thinking of the legacy question. And he asks this question. He says, "How then, in light of all that's happened to me, in light of your husband's confidence in me, in light of God's mercy to me, in light of how I want my story to turn out, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" He's like, "Mrs. Potiphar, I mean, no offense, But why would I want to add adultery to what's turning out to be a pretty good story? In other words, which of these stories do I want to tell? I basically have just two options. Story number one, your husband gave me an incredible opportunity to run his household. I never dreamed this opportunity would ever come my way. So I was faithful to him and to God, who has been faithful to me and who's been watching over me and looking out for me. I mean, that's a good story. Or option two, your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way. So I took advantage of his trust, and I had an affair with his wife. What story do you want to tell? Once again, Joseph opts for the better story. He decides his life in a better direction. He decided a story that was going to be worth telling. He did the right thing, but the right thing, again, leads to Potiphar's wife accusing him of trying to rape her. And Joseph ends up in Pharaoh's dungeon. But Joseph's story doesn't end there. It wasn't over. He ends up being eventually the most powerful person in Egypt. We don't have time to get into how that happened, but if you want to know, Genesis is where you find out. The most powerful one, the most powerful person in all of Egypt, second to only Pharaoh himself. He reconciled with his brothers eventually, and he's the hero of the story because he saves people from the great famine. They're without food. I mean, Joseph is just writing a better story. God's leading him in that direction. Joseph's story wasn't over. And your story isn't over either. God was still working in Joseph's story. He had to make some decisions in the moment that would lead him down a better path. I believe God's working in your story too. And I believe if you will decide some God-pleasing decisions now, it'll lead you down the path of the story of your life that pleases God. And that's worth telling. Joseph's story wasn't over. Your story isn't over. Even when it seems like you're doing the right things, it still leads to unpleasant circumstances. You're doing the right thing. God still is working. Don't compromise. Even if you don't see it yet. Joseph is in Pharaoh's dungeon, looking pretty bad. He's doing all the right things. He's making the right decisions. He could have gone a different direction, but he didn't. Oftentimes it's our responses, it's our decisions in those difficult, unfair chapters of our life that makes all the difference between a story that ends bad and a story that ends well. So what story do you want to tell? When the decisions you are in the middle of making right now are nothing more than a story. Because like Joseph, you're writing the story of your life one decision at a time. And the good news is, if you haven't decided a good story up to now, remember your current chapter is just a current chapter. It's not your whole story. You can start making better decisions today. That brings us to the third question that I want to give on our list. And we call it the conscience question. And the reason we call it the conscience question is because when making a decision, we can sometimes choose to ignore our God-given internal cue known as our conscience. And by conscience, I'm talking about that internal tension competing for our attention when we consider an option of a decision. When we consider doing something, or we consider not to do something, our conscience tries to chime in and get our attention. Especially when we're considering an option that's going to lead to a regret. Your conscience starts chiming in. God put that in there. You ever wonder why people who've had too much to drink are inclined to make such bad decisions? What's the correlation between alcohol consumption and poor decision making? I mean, as far as I know, you may know of an exception, but as far as I know, there's no correlation between alcohol and making good decisions, right? I mean, I've never heard any story that concluded with, it's a good thing I was drunk, otherwise I would have made a really bad decision. So why are people who've had too much to drink inclined to make bad decisions? Well, psychologically speaking, there are two reasons. First, alcohol actually increases norepinephrine in the brain, which acts as a stimulant and increases impulsiveness and decreases inhibition. So there's less sensitivity to the potential consequences of a decision that you might make. You're not thinking of the consequences. The second reason, and perhaps worse, is that alcohol actually temporarily impairs the activity of the prefrontal cortex of our brain. This is the part of your brain that enables you to connect the dots, to think rationally and consequently in order to make good decisions. In other words, alcohol causes a person to act without thinking clearly or without feeling appropriately. It makes you brave when you should be cautious. It makes you loud when you should be quiet. And it causes that internal voice, your conscience, that God put in there to be switched off. So then there's no longer any internal cues that try to get your attention. That's why the following day you're texting with a friend and you're like, I did what? Are you sure it was me? Well, there's video. Oh, man. Well, I guess I had too much to drink. So what does that have to do with us? Well, if you're drunk, it should be obvious, but of course it isn't because, well, we just covered that, right? But if you're sober, here's the thing. While intoxicated folks can't pay attention to their internal cue like their conscience because it's switched off, us sober folks are actually often guilty of choosing to just ignore the eternal cue in our conscience, just ignore it flat out. It's there. We just choose to ignore it. I mean, intoxicated people have basically silenced their conscience, but sober people just ignore it. Again, that internal tension competing for our attention when we're considering an option in a decision. And some of us already know that the outcome and the consequences for ignoring our conscience can lead to devastating results. Some of us know that already, right? Ignoring that voice, ignoring that tension in our spirit. So the third question, the conscience question that we need to ask every time we're making a decision of any magnitude is this. Here it is. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Write that down. While I'm making a decision, when I'm considering options, does one of the options create a tension that deserves my attention? Something just doesn't feel right. It gives me a pause. Sometimes you hear people say, I got a red flag about it. My dad calls it a check in his spirit. Like, I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger on it, but there's just something about it. Doesn't seem right. There's a check in my spirit. You know what I'm talking about? That internal voice, internal sense that something about this just doesn't seem right. And when that happens, let me just tell you something that you probably should already know. Don't ignore it. Don't just rush by it. Don't let the salesperson in your head talk yourself out of it. Pay attention to it. Let it bother you and then act accordingly. It's a reason why it's bothering you. Now, I know that's not easy to do. Again, the salesperson in our head wants you to ignore that feeling. They don't want us to pay attention to that. They kind of lead you away. Don't mind that over there. That's nothing. Well, is it something? No, it's not nothing. It's nothing. Let me show you what I'd like you to do. That's the salesperson talk. But again, if we pause, we pay attention to that tension in our heart, we stand a far better chance at making some God-pleasing decisions. So when something dings your conscience, pay attention to it. God put that in there. Don't ignore it. Now, there's a fascinating and rather well-known story that illustrates this from the life of King David. We know King David, right? Israel's second king. And this story illustrates the importance of paying attention to the inconvenient tension. And I love this story about David. David's one of my favorite Bible heroes. Some of you probably already know David steps onto the page of history as a shepherd boy, right? During that season of his life as a kid, a prophet shows up at his house and announces to his family that God has chosen David to be the next king of Israel. Now, it's a good day when a prophet shows up and says, somebody in your family is going to be king. That's a good day. Now, the problem with this is that Israel already had a king, King Saul. Saul wasn't doing a very good job at being king, so God decided to replace him, but not right away. Again, David's still a boy. So time goes on, and eventually, you guys know how the story goes, young David has this legendary encounter with the giant Goliath, right? We've heard that story, David and Goliath. And in that moment, after killing Goliath, David becomes a hero. He becomes a household name throughout Israel. And it didn't take long for his popularity to exceed that of old King Saul. And you can imagine how that's going over. In fact, Saul becomes jealous of David, in which leads to Saul wanting to try to kill David. And so David is forced to flee for his life. He becomes a fugitive. But again, by now, he's already a legend. He has a reputation, David does, of being a warrior, of being a leader, a giant killer. And so this legend attracts people to David. And so hundreds of men flip to David's side, and before long, David has his own little small army going on. But it was an army without a home, because again, they're fugitives. They're fleeing away from King Saul, who's after David to kill him. Eventually, Saul, he gathers his army. He gathers about 3,000 soldiers to go after little David. All right? I don't know if that's overkill, but he's watched him kill a giant, so he's like, I better make sure I got enough guys for this. So 3,000 soldiers go after David because he feared David, and so he leads his soldiers into the desert to remove this threat to his throne, because Saul eventually wants his son Jonathan to be the next king, not David, Jonathan. And so as the story goes, late one afternoon, as they're winding their way through the rocky hills of the desert, Saul halts his entire army of men so he can find somewhere private to relieve himself. He's got to go. Okay? So he spies out a cave, and he heads off unaccompanied to go take care of business, to have his meeting. Okay? Now, if you know the story, some of you already know the story, you know that this is where the story kind of takes a strange twist, because David and his merry men are actually hiding in the very same cave that Saul chooses to go relieve himself in. I mean, what are the odds of that? And when David and his men see Saul coming into the cave, what do? They just move further back into the cave, right? So imagine this from David's perspective. He and his men are in the back of the cave, staring at the entrance. When Saul appears in the entrance, kind of as a silhouette, because again, he's coming from daylight, they're in a dark cave. And so he appears as a silhouette, walks in, comes in just far enough. And again, Saul's been out in the bright sun, so he's walking in a dark cave. He can't see anything. He walks in just far enough to ensure his privacy, takes off his robe, tosses it to the side, hikes up his outer garment, squats down facing the opening of the cave with his back toward David and his men. Clearly, if you're David, this has to be a sign from God. I mean, come on, what are the odds? God has delivered David's enemy into his hands. What else could this possibly mean? I mean, David's already been anointed king. Everybody knew he was going to be the next king. The only thing standing in his way is the current king, and there he is, unguarded, vulnerable, and unsuspecting. And if David wasn't thinking that way, we know the men around him were thinking that way, because here's what Scripture tells us happened. 1 Samuel 24, verse 4. David's men say to David, probably whispering in the back of the cave, David, this is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Come on, David. Decision made, right? Let's kill Saul and go home. I'm tired of being a fugitive. This was the perfect scenario. No war, minimal bloodshed. Besides, what other option is there right now? So they're thinking, David, come on, just do it. Kill the king before the king kills you. So you can imagine the emotion and the adrenaline that's going on in this cave right now, right? The pressure that David must have felt to act in that moment. But here's what makes this story even more interesting. David felt something else. There was a tension about this. Something didn't feel right. There was a red flag. There was a check in his spirit. He wasn't sure why there was a red flag. Didn't make any sense. And so he did what basically we do most of the time. He ignores it. He decides to act. He ignores the tension. He draws his dagger and creeps up behind Saul with every intention of slitting his throat. If David is successful, everything changes immediately for David. But as he crawls closer, the tension gets louder. And David in his spirit, in spite of the fact that what seemed to be the perfect scenario, paid attention to the tension. He let what was bothering him continue to bother him. And somewhere between leaving his hiding place in the back of the cave and Saul's unprotected back, just seconds away from making a final decision, he gains clarity. Wait a minute. Hit the pause button. I'm about to murder the king. This is murder. This can't be right. It dawns on him, if I do this, I'll be the man who killed the king. That will be my story for the rest of my life. I murdered the king. That's a story I'm going to have to tell my children. That's a story I'm going to have to tell my grandchildren. Like, hey, Grandpa, tell us one more time how you became king. How you snuck up on King Saul when he was using the potty and killed him. Tell us again, Grandpa. That's not the story David wants to tell. And so this is amazing. In spite of that pressure to act, in spite of the expectations of all of his friends just a few yards behind him, David changed his course. And it says, then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe instead. In fact, this is how we know he's paying attention to the tension. The next verse, 1 Samuel 24, verse 5 says, afterward, after doing that, cutting off a corner of his robe, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off the corner of his robe. That even bothered him. And so we know he's paying attention to the tension. He's paying attention to his conscience. And he does what very few people have the self-control to do. He changes course midstream. And of course, David's men in the back of the cave are in shock, right? I mean, they were so close to going home, only to watch this perfect opportunity just slip through their fingers. You can imagine the expressions on their face like, David? Come on, man. And so listen to what David says in verse 6 to his men. He says, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. Again, he's listening to his conscience. He's paying attention to the tension. He's thinking this all through. He says, well, who was it that put Saul on the throne? Wasn't it God? Who made Saul king? Wasn't it God? And who am I to replace what God has put in place? I can't kill the king, even if he's trying to kill me. To which one of his men probably said, well, then can I do it? Right? Because we want to go home. But verse 7 says this, but David sharply rebuked his men. Again, they don't understand it. And did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Wow. Now let me ask you a question. We'll figure out what happens to Saul here in just a minute, but let me ask you a question. Let me ask you, do you want to be the hero of your story? Do you know you get to choose whether or not you're the hero of the story? Do you want to write a story you'll be proud to tell? Then you got to do what David did and pay attention to the tension that's going on, because God put that in there. Don't ignore it. Watch what God did, because David paid attention to that conscience. Months later, Saul and his army are in battle with the Philistines when an archer launches a random arrow that just happens to find a seam in Saul's armor, mortally wounding him. And Saul doesn't want to die at the hands of the Philistines, so he falls on his own sword and dies. And then word reaches the city that he's dead, and they proclaim David king, and David becomes the king without having to murder Saul. That sounds like a God story. A better story. David paid attention to his God-given conscience, which enabled him to make God-pleasing decisions. So in your life, the decisions you're wrestling with right now, is there a tension that deserves your attention? So as we wrap up, I want to challenge you to make some decisions, to start asking some questions. Because, as we talked about earlier, good questions lead to good decisions. And so I'm going to give you these questions ahead of time so you can begin to use them in the decisions that you're making. Our decisions are no better than the questions that we ask or the questions that we don't think to ask. And so the first question I want you to commit to asking is the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself? Really? Even if the truth about yourself makes you feel a little bad about yourself. Because acknowledging where we are is the first step to getting where we ultimately want to be. So when making a decision of any magnitude, ask yourself, am I being honest with myself here? Really? Because the salesperson in your head that sounds an awful lot like you tries to deceive you. That's the first question. The second question that I want you to commit to asking is the legacy question, which is, what story do I want to tell? I want to decide a story I'll be proud to tell. Every time you're faced with a decision of any magnitude, ask this question. When this is nothing more than a story that I tell, what story do I want to tell? and then decide accordingly. Because you write the story of your life one decision at a time. So write a good story. Write a good story. Then I'm going to ask you to commit to asking the third question, and that's the conscience question. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Every time you're considering an option, every time you're making a decision of any consequence, stop and ask this conscience question. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a red flag in my spirit? Is there something that just doesn't feel right? If so, pay attention to that tension like David did, and I promise you, you'll be glad you listened to it. God put that in there for a reason, to save you from an awful lot of heartache and regrets. So let's decide right here, right now, to apply these questions to our lives and see what happens. See what God-pleasing decisions you make. See how God turns those decisions into a better story, a better ending, a better chapter. God really wants you to make better decisions. Your pastor really wants you to make better decisions. Are you with me on this? Next week we're going to get another one, so don't miss it. Would you bow your head and close your eyes? Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the examples you've given to us in Scripture. God, I pray that you'd help us make God-pleasing decisions with what we're wrestling with right now. Whatever the options are, whatever the decision is, of any magnitude, big or small, help our heart's desire to want to please you with the decisions that we make. God, I pray you'd help us be honest with ourselves, to not pay attention to the salesperson in our head that deceives us. God, help us to think of the story that we're writing. What story do we want to tell? Help us to write good stories with the decisions that we make. And then, God, help us to pay attention to the conscience you put inside our hearts. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? God, I believe if we do this, we're going to please you. So help us to be those type of people. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. God's good. We celebrate his goodness.
Before our usher team comes forward to receive our tithes and offerings and response cards, here's a few important things happening with our CE family.
Meeting characters at Disney is one of the highlights of many vacations. This fall, you can meet and greet your favorite characters right here with Kid Experience. Each week, your child will have the opportunity to meet a new character from one of his or her favorite movies, but with a purpose. Come early, take pictures, and be ready for a ton of fun in Kid Experience as we bring stories from the Bible to life in a fun and engaging way. We can't wait to see you this Sunday. As our ushers come forward to collect our response cards and receive our tithes and offerings,
God's word teaches us a pattern of generosity in 2 Corinthians 9:11, as it says, "You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God." God's people are generous, ministry is funded, and lives are changed by the gospel. And then there's increased thanksgiving to God through our worship for what he did among us. Has his generosity changed in your life? Are you living generously toward his kingdom? For those who faithfully give to God through CE and fuel this movement of life transformation, thank you so much. You truly make a difference every single day.
Thank you for being on mission with us to help more people experience a full life in Jesus Christ.
It's been an amazing day with you at CE. You may have made a commitment during the service, and we'd love to have you reach out and tell us about it by scanning the QR code. If you have questions, comments, or prayer requests, you can scan the code or go to churchexperience.tv/connect. Hope to hear from you. If you haven't, check out our CE social media, Instagram, Facebook, website, or app. Make sure you do, or go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've loved our time together, and we can't wait to see you next week.